one of the things about Scottish history is we hear a lot about battles and we hear a lot about men basically getting promotions. That's essentially what the history of, royals fighting each other is. But there are so many more interesting stories that we haven't been told.
Lovely to see you all here. Thanks so much for coming. My name is Jenny Brown, and this event has been very kindly sponsored by the Open University in Scotland. And I'm delighted to chair Denise Mina, one of the UK's leading crime writers. Denise, your novels, 15 novels, have won so many awards. The Long Drop, based on the Peter Manuel case, won the McIlvanney Scottish Prize for the Scottish Book of the Year. The Gordon Byrne Prize as well. And your last novel, The Less Dead, was shortlisted for the Costa Novel of the Year. And you've written plays and graphic novels, but you're here to talk about a very different book. And Rizzio is a novella, which on the face of it seems like you've done a kind of U-turn on your previous work. It recounts one of the most infamous and darkest episodes in Scottish history, and not a mile away from here, in 1566, Mary Queen of Scots' private secretary, David Rizzio, was brutally murdered. Tell us why you decided to write about this extraordinary period.
Well, it's such an, I think things are really changing, and I think the way we tell history is really changing. And all of a sudden, people are realizing that we've always heard the same stories. And actually, you can tell a lot more about people from the spaces between the stories. So this is a story, and often if you say to people in Scotland, I have to say, with all your masks on, it looks as if we've taken a lot of hostages. I was thinking that when the camera was panning round. But one of the things about Scottish history is we hear a lot about battles and we hear a lot about men basically getting promotions. That's essentially what the history of royals fighting each other is. But there are so many more interesting stories that we haven't been told. And one of the things that researching that story of that weekend, because it was just a weekend, was that people vaguely know that Rizzio was murdered, and they know he's murdered, where he was murdered, because they see the bloodstains when they go to the palace. But they don't really understand that there were the background to it and the story of it and how she got out of it. So very traditionally in these stories, a man forces his will on everybody else. That's what happens in almost all these stories is, William Wallace, is so inspirational, everybody wants to die for him. Someone raises an army. But actually what happened here was the whole thing hung on a woman who should not have been kind to Mary Queen of Scots, being kind to Mary Queen of Scots. And she was invisible because she was middle-aged. She was so old that the guards weren't watching her.
Was she all of 50?
She was about 50. She was still close to death, But it was Lady Huntley, and she was carrying like a piss pot, so nobody searched her properly. And she was very old and she didn't have any money, so her family were sort of poor. They'd had all their goods confiscated, and so nobody was watching her. So she trained Mary to pretend she was having a miscarriage. She kept saying, do this, now do that, now do this, because Mary Queen of Scots was 6 months pregnant, and they thought if she was they wanted her to die, but they didn't want to have to kill her. And they thought if she was having a miscarriage, she would probably die. So Lady Huntley coached her to pretend to have a miscarriage, and so they dropped the guard, and then Lady Huntley helped her escape, which is like one of those it was history changing, because she went on to give birth to James VI, burst of England. She absolutely changed the world, but because it's not that story that we tell all the time about history. There's a great documentary on Netflix actually about the royals. It's one of these, Everything Explained, and one of them is about the royals. And there are these Jamaican academic women, and one of them says, you don't really get the story of the hunt until you've spoken to the lion. And we never hear from the lion, but we are starting to hear from the lion, and these stories are amazing.
Your book is the start of a new series.
Yes.
Darklands?
Darklands. And so it's a rewriting of episodes from Scottish history. So I've done Rizzio, Jenny Fagan is doing The Witch Trials, that comes out next year. Alan Warner is doing Bonnie Prince Charlie and the 45 Uprising. And it's going to be an ongoing series of books about Scots history.
Did you choose this particular
No.
subject?
This has happened before. The editor is called James Crawford, right, who you may have seen on television. He does Scotland from the Air. And he commissioned a series of short stories for a collection called Bloody Scotland. And everyone had to pick a location. And because he worked for the Historic Environment Scotland, he could get us all access to these absolutely amazing places, and we could go in and get private tours. Now, I forgot to answer the email. So I got Edinburgh Castle, because they were amazing places. They were like, you know, what's the seminary out in Cardross called? Not Cardross. I mean, they were just amazing places, and he got access to go into the rooms and all this kind of thing. But I forgot to answer the email, so I ended up with Edinburgh Castle. And I wrote a story, and he said, he edited it quite brutally, and which I really like, actually, because I just want to know what you think. I don't, you know, do you know what I mean? And it does get harder to get edited as you get older, because people have read your stuff maybe at university, and then they get your manuscripts and they think, God, that's a bit rubbish. Well, maybe she'll make it better. Whereas before, people would read your manuscripts and think, that's a bit rubbish, she better make it better. You know, and so as an older writer or someone who's been on the go for a while, people are quite wary about saying to you, that's so tedious. You know, why are they travelling for 50 pages? Can they not just be there? But Jamie just does that because I think he's always in a hurry, because he's always got lots of fingers and lots of pies. So he edited that story that I wrote for that very brutally, and it won the Crime Writers, it won the Dagger for the best short story of the year. And you know, I mean, I think we talk about writers as if they exist in a vacuum, but actually, you know, there is a kind of magic when you're working with a good editor, and he's a really great editor. So he said, you're doing Rizzio, and I was like, oh, okay then. And then I started to research it, and he actually got me into Holyrood Palace for a private tour of the chambers, and the curator talked me through, you know, they'd moved the staircase. It used to be right next to Mary's bed, so that Darnley could come up from down. I'm sorry, the book isn't out yet, and you probably don't know what I'm talking about. I'm talking as if we all know what I'm talking about, but clearly. The essential story is that Darnley wanted Mary Queen of Scots' secretary killed, and all the elite of Scotland wanted this man killed to send Mary a signal that they were not going to tolerate being told what to do by her, because she had confiscated a lot of their lands. Parliament were meeting on Tuesday to confirm that all their lands and titles were being removed, and on the Saturday night they staged this coup. But because they were Scottish, they didn't just stage a coup. It wasn't like Italians. They didn't go about stabbing each other. They spent months drawing up contracts about how they were going to do this. There were 2 sets of contracts, and almost everyone in Scotland had signed them. And the idea was that they would kill Rizzio, maybe kill the Queen, and Lord Darnley would become the king. But he was an idiot. And I always think about Lord Darnley. When you think about him, you really have to think about Donald Trump is his dad, Lord Lennox, and Don Jr. is Darnley. Now, I don't know if you've ever seen Don Jr. film of him. I don't know how you could avoid it. But there is something missing. And I don't honestly think he does take that much cocaine. I think there's something fundamentally missing with it. This is actually going, I could get sued. I forgot we weren't just talking.
But Darnley, I mean, to Mary to begin with, he's sex on legs.
Oh, he is gorgeous. No, I mean, he just is, though. Do you know what I mean? He just is. He's a handsome man. And to be a queen and get to marry someone you fancy, I mean, that must have been quite a thing. That must have been quite the power move for Mary to say, I'm going to marry somebody I find attractive. But when you're 19 and you fancy someone, it doesn't always mean they're going to be a good life partner. And I think this is proof of that principle.
Before we go any further, do you want to give us a short reading?
Yes,
and you'll see that Denise has kindly dressed to suit her new book.
Perfectly disguised. So this is actually to stave off when the press ask you to pretend to read your own book for a photograph. Like, you're going to read your own book. And that way they won't even be able to see, and they'll make me do something else. So this is from the very beginning. And I wanted to take an oblique look at this and, you know, I use a lot of sort of contemporary language in the book, and one of the reasons for that, it came from The Long Drop actually, and it was an approach that I used in The Long Drop of, instead of giving a great overarching history of what happened, which is what tends to happen in history books and true crime books, they're much more similar than you would suppose. Instead of doing that, I wanted to focus on a very short period of time to actually get to see the dynamics and the characters. I think it feels fresh to me. And also, you know, looking at history, I think you're always looking at history through the prism of now. And so I use a lot of contemporary language and contemporary idioms to kind of convey that, because it feels like a bit of a fib to try and pretend that we're back there. We can't possibly look back on that. I found it very hard to tell the story as if it was happening right now. And anyway, so this is from the very beginning. One of the things that, you know, with politics being so polarized, one of the things that I find very interesting is the fact that people are winding up and polarizing communities, and they're doing it for money, and there really is nothing in it for the people who are being wound up. The true believers are always the losers, so I wanted to really focus on a true believer as well. David Rizzio plays tennis with his assassins. Late Saturday afternoon, 9th of March, 1566. Indoor tennis court, Palace of Holyrood, Edinburgh. Lord Ruthven wanted him killed during this tennis match, but Darnley said no. Darnley wants it done tonight, and he wants his wife to witness the murder, because David Rizzio is her closest friend, her personal secretary, and she's very pregnant. Darnley hopes that if she sees Rizzio being horribly brutalised, then she might miscarry and die in the process. She's the queen. They've been battling over Darnley's demands for equal status since their wedding night, and if she dies, and the baby dies, then Darnley's own claim to the throne will be undeniable. They are rivals for the crown. She knew that from the off. He wants it done in front of her. Darnley serves to Rizzio, and Rizzio returns it with an elegant stroke. The cork ball soars across the court, reaches the far quarter and bounces high enough to land on the sloped wooden awning over the watchers' benches. There's a loud smack as it lands, rolls to the edge and falls onto the court. Plop, plop, plop. Point to Rizzio. Underneath that sloping roof is a man called Henry Yare. He's watching the game, sitting on a bench built into the wall of the interior court. He's Lord Ruthven's retainer. He's here to keep an eye on Darnley for the boss. Yare hates everyone here, and he especially hates tennis. Tennis is what's wrong with people. Yare is very pale, his eyes red-rimmed because he hasn't been sleeping. He's watchful. He sees plots everywhere. Yare thinks in binaries: good, bad, man, woman, Calvinist, Catholic, for God or against God. Once fervently Catholic, he's now ferociously Calvinist. And when he saw the truth, he embraced it, and he hates those that don't, those Catholic holdouts. How can they hold on to these old, broken ideas? How can they defend a church so corrupt, so murderous, such a betrayal of the one true faith? They disgust him. He doesn't know how they can live with themselves. The other Calvinists congratulate him on his passion. They overlook the implied violence in his fanaticism because he's on their side. The Reformation is recent, the issue undecided. It's not yet safe. Everyone is afraid of a revival of the Roman religion, of being killed for their beliefs, of spies and foreign interventions. Men as hot and spirited as Yare are useful to the Protestant movement. So tomorrow morning, when fellow Calvinists hear that Yare was creeping around Edinburgh, when they learn what he did and who he killed, they'll all feign surprise. But in the darkness of their hearts, they'll each remember his sallow face and wide, watery eyes, his explosive reaction to any hint of dissent. And they'll admit to themselves that this was inevitable, that they rewarded his disquieting fervour, and they've long known this could happen. Could have been any one of them stabbed in their beds. Yare was always a killing spree, looking for an excuse. I'll just stop there. He's terrifying here. Thank you.
It's terrifying, but your readership will know what happened. And so how do you go about creating this? I mean, it is thrilling to read, but how do you go about creating that when so many of the readers will know what happened in history?
That's so interesting, because that is a true crime problem. How do you tell a story when everyone knows that Peter Manuel gets hung at the end? How do you have tension within that? And I think, for example, in The Long Drop, the way I did it was, the way I tried to introduce narrative tension was have contrasting scenes. So they're, at the very beginning, they go out on a drinking spree together, the murderer and the family of the murdered family. The murderer and the father who didn't die. And then cut to a scene in the courtroom where and that's how the reader finds out that the murderer is one of the people on the drinking spree. So just have contrast. So for me, the narrative there was the bits missing, and the audience, the pending question, which is what Graham Greene talks about. How does, always be aware of the pending question in the reader's mind, not your mind. You're interested in things they're not interested in. There was a whole chapter in here about the history of public executions and the social meanings of public executions, and it was absolutely fascinating, and I'll tell you about it privately, but it was quite tedious narratively, do you know what I mean? Because the audience weren't wondering about that. They weren't thinking, I wonder what the people watching this are thinking. They wanted to know what year thought. So in this one, actually, to introduce narrative tension, I thought what's really interesting about this is the number of times they could have killed Mary. And why did they not kill Mary? Because what they really wanted was her dead. And it was just a happenstance. There was lots of different slips of moments where she didn't get killed. So I think when you're writing something that people do know the outcome of, you have to ask yourself, what's the draw? What is drawing the reader through? What are they wondering about? Can you make them wonder about something other than the end?
Let's talk about Mary. She's very young.
Yeah.
I mean, is she 21 at this time?
I think she's 23.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
And how did you begin to approach such an iconic figure?
Well, I think with characters who are very, very well known, I mean, I think the one thing that really puzzled me about her was what was her attachment to Rizzio. And I grew up moving around Europe, like a lot of people. And she grew up moving around Europe. Rizzio grew up moving around Europe. And then when you come somewhere where people are quite static and you meet other people who have moved around a lot, I get on great with army brats, I get on great with diplomats' kids, because you are always slightly outside, and there is that sense of, that you have a kind of, you're always sort of watching everything through a veil. You don't really, although you do belong, you don't really feel that you belong. And I think a lot of refugees feel that way as well, actually, is that, I have friends who are refugees and live in Glasgow and have seen bits of Glasgow that Glaswegians don't go and see, because we're always tourists slightly. So I think her connection with Rizzio is that she is very emotionally engaged with him in a way she isn't with her relatives quite often. But actually, once there's a smoke of history around someone, they're quite hard to get to, And she was very good looking, and that's another smoke screen, being very good looking. And she was very powerful, and that's another smoke screen. Because I think you can connect with her as a character, as a woman, but she wasn't really a woman, she was a queen, which is a different thing. And you can connect with her as someone who had an uncertain childhood and felt quite unsafe. But at the same time, she was always a queen, and Catherine de' Medici was her mother-in-law. And so she's quite a hard character to get. But she's always talked about in connection with Elizabeth I, as if she's like got a walk-on part in the Queen Vic. And actually, she's a really fascinating character. She doesn't need Elizabeth I to be interested. Elizabeth I is a bit of a cardboard cutout as well, because when people are very powerful, they do become incredibly defended. So she's always presenting herself. She doesn't seem to be disinhibited at any point, so she's quite hard to get through to, She's
I mean, she has such a difficult relationship with her in-laws, for instance. Poor Mary. She's hated by them.
They're awful. Do you know, Lennox, for those who haven't had the chance to read the book yet, well, why would you? It's not out. But Darnley's dad, right, who is Trump, he had this uprising in Dumbarton, and the army all left, right? So there were all these nobles who just said, right, we've won, and they went away. And to get them to come back, he took all their children hostage. And then they came back, and he was so angry, he killed the children. He killed like 15 children. And people in Scotland never forgot that. So killing a child within the Lennox family was, you know, I mean, the threats to James VI's life were consistent and always. So this is the sort of family. So Lennox, the man who killed all the children, is working Darnley from the back. And he somehow manages to get through the Reformation, and nobody really knows what his religion is. I mean, that is quite something. I mean, he's such a slippery man. And he's the one that's sort of orchestrating everything from the back. And they connected with her, but they just wanted something from her. He tried to marry Mary before she married his son. He also tried to marry Mary's mother, but she clocked him. So Lennox, his father, is you know, a real bag of poison, and she didn't have a good relationship with them, but nobody had a good relationship with him. But he was universally loathed. I mean, that's, you know, even for then, even in a time where, you know, there's a bit in the book where Lady Huntley, who's the lady that saves Mary Queen of Scots, her husband had risen in a rebellion against Mary and died on the battlefield of a heart attack. So Mary had his body stuffed, and they took him to the Scottish Parliament and they put him on trial for treason. Talk about selective, you know, because when you see films about this period, everyone's wearing lovely frocks and going horse riding, but they're not taxidermying men and wheeling them into the Scottish Parliament, and the whole of the Scottish Parliament. So they hear the case.
It's monstrous.
It's just so grim. It's so dark. I mean, the times were so dark. You know, but we're very selective in what we remember. So the next time you see a period piece where people are wearing tapestries and noncing about and talking in strange language, just remember that they actually stuffed a man and put him on trial in the Scottish Parliament.
So this is the background to Lady Huntley being Mary's, what, chief lady in waiting,
yeah,
or whatever. So we must think that she hates Mary.
She not only put her stuffed husband on trial, but she also executed Lady Huntley's son. I know, it's just grim. I'd love to see a film of this, because I just would love to see that scene where they wheel in the taxidermied man. I keep thinking about his eyes. What did they do with his eyes? But anyway, did they just sew them shut, or did they draw eyes on him? I don't know. But you know, Scots lawyers stood up and defended him, and someone prosecuted him, and and then they voted. So Lady Huntley was very well to do. Her husband did that. She had all of her stuff confiscated. So this would be tapestries and plate, and it was put in Holyrood Palace. Then she was taken. I mean, being a lady in waiting was really being. She was a prisoner. So she's serving the woman who executed her son and did that to her husband, and she's walking past all her soft furnishings all day. And even within that, she found a way to be kind and to help that woman. And she didn't make loads of money out of it. She didn't, you know, her son had run away, but she didn't, you know, she didn't benefit from it really. And you know, she wasn't running into a room and sword fencing anybody. She did this over 48 hours. She stayed with her. She coached her. She came up with a couple of schemes. Didn't work. Mary said, "I can't climb out of the window on a rope. I'm 6 months pregnant," which is quite a good point actually. So she came up with another scheme, and she did that. But you know, I'm sure when you look back and you look at people's motives, I'm sure you could come up with there was a good reason for it. But just this year, just noticing how tenderly people treat each other and how kind people are in moments of real crisis, I would really love to believe that it was just one of those moments of history-changing kindness, that she was grieving and she was very sad, and she just decided to be nicer than she needed to be, which you saw a lot of people doing this year. And it's one of those things that never gets noticed in history books, you know?
Because what history focuses on, of course, is this really brutal assassination.
Yeah.
Can you just paint that picture of how it happened?
So they're sitting in a very small room having supper. Lord Darnley comes in. He never comes in because he's fallen out with Mary, and he sits next to her and he's affectionate to her. And I think the first clue that something was really up was that he shut the door after himself. And he was such an arse that he would never shut a door. These are really drafty, because I'm sitting there and I'm trying to imagine what happened. He would never shut a door after himself because he's very, you know, into power. So he shuts the door after himself, which he would do as a courtesy to the other people in the room to stop the draft coming in. But the reason he's done that is because the army are outside, right? He doesn't want them to know. So that was the first clue. And then he sat down next to Mary and he put his arm around her waist and squeezed. She's 6 months pregnant. And this is when it all kicks off. Then the people that he's let into the palace come up, and his apartments are the only way into Mary's apartments because there's this private staircase next to the beds. So they come in, they cross over and let the rest of the people in because they unlock Mary's door from the inside, and they all pile in. Now, I'm sure that this was one of the inspirations for Julius Caesar, because Shakespeare's Julius Caesar was written 20 years later or something like that, and for James VI, actually, for the court of James VI, I think. 1605, that would be James VI, wouldn't it? So they drag Rizzio out, they take him into another room, and then they take turns stabbing him, because it's very important that everyone is implicated in this murder so that no one can say he did it. So if they're all in it together, then everyone is implicated, which is why Caesar was stabbed by so many people. And the one sword that is left in him is Darnley's, right? That's very important. So Lennox has clearly said, if anyone's taking the fall for this, it has to be Darnley. It has to be my son. He's lovely, isn't he? He's so nice. And so Rizzio dies in the public rooms, and then Mary is held captive for 2 days.
And that's where Lady Huntley comes in.
And Lady Huntley is left with her, yeah. Because very often they say things like, you know, there was no one in the room. Now, one of the leaders of the rebellion gives a 10-page affidavit the next day, and Mary Queen of Scots gives a statement 10 days later, so we know basically what everyone said.
Have you read all these?
Yeah, they're really amazing. Lord Ruthven's is amazing because he's like a really bad defendant, and he keeps saying, and then everyone was stabbing, and I just said, stop, everyone, make sure the Queen doesn't get hurt. And you know what I mean? Like that would happen. And you know, and I made sure that she had a drink of water and stuff. You're stabbing people to death in front of her, you know. But he's got his legal defences in place all the way through, and it's just a tissue of lies. But Mary's is really terrifying. And you know, there are moments where she's very pregnant, and she tries to save Rizzio by standing in front of him. And some of the attackers come up, and one of them points a gun at her belly and gets her to move. And another one reaches over her with a knife. It was actually John Knox's son-in-law, because the Reformation has just happened, and they all think if this Catholic queen, you know, reinstitutes Catholicism, we are all going to be murdered. So the atmosphere is really febrile. Nobody trusts anybody. And she has a chapel, Catholic chapel there. She has statues of, you know, Our Lady in her audience chamber. She has a lot of Catholic paraphernalia around the place. It was quite funny actually, because when I went to see the palace, my family are Catholic, and there was a woman who was showing me around, and she had a Northern Irish accent. And she was showing me around, and I was thinking, how do you come to be doing this, you know? And then she said, and you know, and these are the, what is this they call them? The prayer beads? I was like, yeah, I think I know the word for that, yeah. So it's still there, you know, and those dynamics are still there, you know, that division of culture that people just don't understand each other because they come from a very different place. Do you know what I mean? And I think she was reaching for that point that Elizabeth first got to, where there would be a kind of blindness, and Elizabeth said we would not make windows into men's souls, and but they were by no means there yet, you know, in Scotland, that there was no sense of there being a toleration of difference, of any kind of difference.
You talk about the affidavits. Who was looking at them at the time and receiving them and presumably making some sort of judgment, but given that so many of the leading families were all involved in this?
Lord Ruthven was dying anyway, right? So when he arrives, he is, again, like 30 years before Don Quixote. He is dressed as Don Quixote. He's wearing armour, like ramshackle bits of crap. I mean, he's wearing it at one point. He's dying. He's very, very ill. So he's sort of reeling around wearing this really mad outfit, and people are trying not to laugh at him. Because one of the things he's wearing is a metal bowl on his head to stop anyone stabbing him in the crown. And he keeps falling over and having to sit down because he's so ill. So they obviously thought, well, we can try him. That's not going to cause ructions. Because he's dying anyway, and he did die, and he was very, very unpopular. That was another thing you have to be. I mean, it is like high school. He was a really unpopular man. Everyone hated him, and he was a suspected necromancer, Lord Ruthven. So he was the face of the rebellion, and that's why they got a statement off him. But when it came to it, Darnley issued, this is how hypocritical it was, Darnley issued a statement saying, we are going to prosecute anyone who was involved in this. Darnley, his name is on the contract. He was involved in it. His sword is in the body. And 4 people got to the gallows. 2 of them were landowners, and they were pardoned on the gallows. Henry Yare was just a retainer. He gets executed. Another guy, some balloon from Perth, gets executed, and that's it. But everybody else gets off scot-free. So you know, I was watching the coup, the January 6th coup in Washington, and I was thinking, you know, the biggest idiots in this are going to get done, but the people who orchestrated it, paid for it, and called for it are not going to get done because there's too many of them. There's too many of them, and they're too powerful. So, you know, very often what happens in these cases, and you see it all the way through history, is a couple of idiots get done who are not connected, and they take the fall for everybody else. And that's exactly what happened during this coup.
Was that one of the attractions for you in writing it and researching it? Was that so many parallels you're seeing?
No, because that happened. The coup happened after. January 6th happened after I'd written it. But actually, there are so many parallels with all contemporary history. Just, you know, you see people online being radicalised, you know, white supremacists being radicalised. These people have everything to lose. Who's doing this and why are they doing it? Well, they're doing it to sell hats. They're doing it to raise money. You know, the whole big lie in the States that Trump didn't lose the election, he knows he lost the election. He's doing it because people will give money to support the campaign to have him reinstated. It's always about money. It's so boring. It's never about anything else.
So it's deeply, deeply political context to this episode in history. And they are the whatever, upper class, elite, landed. And we just have a glimpse of the ordinary Edinburgh citizen. As they come, they're worried about what's happening at the palace, and they try.
Isn't that a lovely episode? Yeah. I didn't know that. So what happens is, you know, it's Holyrood Palace, so it's just big windows. And the people of Edinburgh loved Mary. And they saw fighting in the windows, and they saw lights going out because all the lights got knocked over at one point. So they called the watch, and about 600 men in Edinburgh with kitchen knives and torches marched down the Royal Mile to the palace to find out what's going on, and is the Queen okay? And they don't recognise the guard, and they know something's wrong. And anyway, so they sort of chat to them, and they form an arc around them. These are just townspeople, out their beds, come down to protect their queen. And the guards give a rubbish answer. One of them was the second man who was killed on the gallows, Scott, the guy from Perth. And I don't know why I keep saying that, as if I'm trying to slur Perth or something. But so he's a sheriff from Perth, and he is also Ruthven's man. And so they give a rubbish excuse, and they're just kind of like, don't worry about it, just go back, it's fine. No, we're not the usual guard, don't worry about it, it's fine. And the keepers of the watch decide they're going to go into the palace and save the Queen because something clearly is going on. And then the window opens and Darnley hangs out. And Darnley says, it's all fine. We found a papal spy. And we've captured him now, and you can all go. But so he's the king, so what can they do? They can't do anything. So they just turn around and they go back. And papal spies were a big thing. I mean, Yare then goes into Edinburgh and kills a papal spy who was called Adam Black. He was a priest in Edinburgh, but his spy name was John Noir. And why that has not been made into a Sunday night TV series, John Noir of Edinburgh, the papal spy. He stabs him in his bed. And another priest was killed in Edinburgh that night. So it was just a big kind of frenzied convulsion in Edinburgh. But the watch did what they could, but because Darnley was involved in it, so it could have changed, it could have gone any way at any point, There's so many junctures at which it could have reversed. It's fascinating.
You said to me just before we began that you're not really interested in the royals.
In the royals? No.
Yeah. I mean, and certainly how this fits with your other work. When I was just thinking about your last book, of course, The Less Dead, in which you're giving a voice to women who have really been overlooked by history. How was it for you to be writing about that elite?
I'm a socialist. And if you're a socialist, you try not to be prejudiced against people wherever they come from. And that is up or down the scale. So you can see the humanity in anybody. Harry and Meghan had a fight at their wedding, I believe. And I was saying the other day, if you don't have a fight at your wedding in Glasgow, you're not legally married. That's all I know about them. I'm sure they're all very nice people. I think it's a silly institution, and I think it's economically silly. And I often watch, historical films about royals fighting each other, and I just don't care, because it's just, when I was about 14, I watched Top of the Pops one night, and I realized this is someone else's sales figures, and we're supposed to be emotionally engaged with someone else's sales figures. I don't care about this. And the same with the royals. I watch it and I just think, these are rich people trying to get richer, and they're killing each other, and I don't care. And when someone becomes king, they've got a promotion at their job, and they had to kill somebody to get a promotion. I don't really care about that. But at the same time, I think, with The Less Dead was sort of true crime fiction mashup. And it was about a series of true murders that happened in Glasgow in the 80s of street sex workers. And there's a term, the less dead, and that is about people that we care about less. So women of colour, women who have a history of sex work, men who have a history of sex work, gay men, refugees, people from poor backgrounds. We don't really talk about them. And since that book came out, actually, Sarah, and it doesn't mean that you don't care about the people who do attract sympathy. So the Sarah Everard case happened, and weeks before that, there was a case of two women of colour, and their mother, Mina Smallwood, I think her name is, she had to campaign to get the police to even look for those women because they were women of colour. I think if you try not to be prejudiced against people because of their background, the world looks very different. And writing something like The Less Dead and something like this, they feel like very much the same project, because people can have horrific backgrounds and come from money. You don't know where people are from. You don't know, love ad hominem. Do you know what I mean? You have to talk to the people that are in front of you and be interested in the people that are in front of you. But with someone like Mary Queen of Scots, because there is such a big smoke around her, it's very hard to see who she really is, Like if you meet very famous movie stars, they're very much doing their performance. I've reached the point now where someone says, do you want to meet so-and-so? And I'm like, no, I don't really want to meet so-and-so, because I know they're going to talk about, it's very boring. I'd rather sit at a bus stop and talk to somebody, because they're not going to give you a load of shit that you've heard before.
But I'm just thinking about Long Drop, Less Dead, now Rizzio. I mean, in terms of your writing, Could you go back now and just write a straight, what we'd call a straight crime novel? What would Ian Rankin say about you? He said...
What is
that
she
you
doing?
push the... No, he said you push the crime novel in new and exciting directions. How satisfying would it be for you just to go back, just to write something?
Well, as we speak,
yes.
I just finished a book.
And
I'd love to say it is just a straightforward crime book, but I wrote a book called Conviction, which was about someone who becomes obsessed with the true crime podcast and goes off and tries to solve it. And I listened to a lot of true crime podcasts, and one of the things that technically what I find fascinating about that is it's a really new form of storytelling. You know, all the exposition is in different chapters, and the exposition is narrative, and it's like a lot of short stories all joined together. It's a fascinating form, and you know, I find that fascinating. Anyway, so I've just written one, and what I'm always thinking is, what would I like to read right now? What I would like to read right now is a romping adventure about nothing at all, with very high stakes. So the story, it's called Confidant, and it's something, and my editor sort of said, you've been interested in that for a while, because I've been trying to write this book for ages, but I finally tricked her into letting me. But it's about the international artifacts and antiques market. So have you heard of Urbex, where people go in and film, yeah? People go in and film their abandoned factories and stuff like this. So it's about someone who breaks into an abandoned French chateau, and all the stuff is still there, and there's like jumpers thrown over banisters and things like that. But she finds a secret room, and in the secret room is a silver casket, and the silver casket belonged to Pontius Pilate. And inside the silver casket is the execution order for the crucifixion, and no one knows where it is. So that's the starting point, and then it comes up for auction in Paris. So it's a podcast, true crime adventure, but you know, sometimes I think when things feel very hard, I think we really need escapism, and I think people talk about narrative and escapism as if it's a bad thing, but I think over the past couple of years, we have all appreciated that actually, you know, it's probably more important than penicillin for lots of us. Do you know what I mean? Really, do you know what I mean? It's just like 1 hour a day where you're not thinking about what you're worried about. You're not dealing with lots of changes, which is very difficult for everybody. So anyway, I wrote this book, and so in the back of my head, there's a little door, and although I physically appear to be here, I can run out through that door at any point and go off and find out where that silver casket is. It's just like having a little
Have you finished it?
Yes. I've got like a week to finish it, and I'm very into it. Do you know what I mean? So, but you know when you're reading a book and you can't wait to get back to it, and you feel like you've got your little extension on your house at the back of your head, you can go and sit in the extension and have a little breather. So I'm just finishing it off, and I've just got like another 2 scenes to write.
Fantastic. We've got time for some questions. We've got a roving microphone. If you'd like to ask Denise any questions, there's one right at the back there.
Nothing is too cheeky, by the way.
Nothing is too cheeky. And we've also got questions from our online audience. So just keep your hand up if you'd like to ask a question. Okay.
Do you mind pulling your mask down when you speak so we can hear you a wee bit clearly?
There we go. I just learned that the last Laird of Restalrig was posthumously tried for treason against the king, and they dug up his body and they put him on trial.
Who was this?
So, Restalrig down in Leith.
Oh, wow.
There's a wee plaque in the park there. So, could that be a potential new novel of all the people in Scotland who were posthumously dug up or taxidermed and tried? Because I would read that.
What was the date? Do you know off the top of your head?
I think it was 15, 16 something.
It must have been a thing they did then. What was going on with them? You write it and I'll read it. I'd love to read that. Who is this? Did somebody do a line in Taxidermy and Treasonists or something like that? There has to be a story there. Yeah. There's someone with their hand up down here?
Taxidermy is a fascinating subject.
Isn't it, though?
I was just wondering, having listened to the discussion this afternoon, looking at that period of history and the tension between the Reformed religion and the Catholic Church and Mary as a Catholic monarch and the whole thing around regicide of a monarch and what that would have meant, I just wondered, when you were exploring that side of it, did you find it interesting that Mary was trying to find a way for both religions to exist side by side, even though John Knox didn't seem particularly interested in a peace deal at the time?
Yeah, and I think the reason that he wasn't that interested in a peace deal, and that's putting it mildly, I think when we say he wasn't that interested in a peace deal, what we mean is he wanted to kill everybody. But I mean, the thing is, they thought they were the underdogs. It's very hard for us to understand what the Reformed Church felt like at that time, but they were the underdogs. And, you know, within 15 years, they would control everything. But at that time, they could have been killed for their faith, which was very firmly held. And I think also we're doing her some favours saying she was looking for a middle ground. I don't think she was. I think she fluffed it a bit, you know. I think she thought if she had a baby, then she would be set. If she had a boy particularly, she would be set, and then she would have made her move. And I suspect that's what they thought as well. So it was a very strange window, and it's very easy to say, oh, well, you know, it became the official state religion. You know, they were picking on someone, but they were the underdogs at the time. But it's such an interesting juncture in history at that point. Essentially, what that dispute was about, it was not really just about freedom of religion for the aristos who were involved in it. It was about money, because the big dispute, and how familiar and relevant does this feel, was, are we going to take money from England or are we going to take money from Europe? That was what it was. It wasn't, are we going to add to the jollity of the nation in England, or are we going to contribute to the EU? It was all about who are we going to tap, essentially. And the Reformed Church very much wanted to be part of England, and the Catholic contingent in Scotland very much wanted to be part of Europe, because that was Catholic. So that's how old this debate is about, should we face England or should we face Europe? I'm afraid I don't have an answer for anybody. If you're looking for a position, I don't really have an answer, but it's interesting to go back and look at how ancient that dispute is.
It's also interesting because parts of Scotland never adopted the new religion and remained Catholic all the way through the Reformation period.
The islands, because they were too far away, so the reformers got halfway up the Hebrides and then just essentially said, fuck it.
Thanks very much for your question. We've got quite a few questions coming in from online. David Kenvin, thanks for your question, says, do you think David Rizzio and Mary, Queen of Scots, were lovers, given that Henry the Fourth said of James VI, they call him the modern Solomon because he is the son of David who played upon the harp?
Right, David. So Rizzio was Italian and James VI was a ginger. I rest my case. I don't know why anyone would think that James VI could have had an Italian dad, because being a ginger, as I know from my family, is a recessive gene. And I mean, he was a massive ginger. He was almost blue. He had the same skin color as me. And so, you know, I think if an Italian had brushed his mother in a corridor, he would have had different colouring. But it was a way of insulting Mary, and it was, you know, legitimacy. The legitimacy of James VI was such a huge issue throughout his life, and it was just a way of insulting him through his mother. So,
here's another online question: if you had the opportunity, which famous or infamous person would you stuff?
Oh.
Thanks for that one.
Who would I stuff? Stalin, just to be classy. Who would I stuff? I don't know. I remember seeing Jeremy Bentham's body in the university bar in London a long time ago. I don't think he's kept in the bar anymore, but it used to be when you went into the bar at UCL, you would walk in and he was in a glass case. It was quite weird. And Bentham believed that you should use stuffed corpses as ornamentation in your garden, I think. Yeah, that was one of his odder ideas. He was a fascinating character. But yeah, I don't know. Is it a punishment or is it laudatory? Is it Lenin or is it Bentham? Would you be in a bar? Would you be in a, I don't know. So many choices.
We've also got, Sabrina says, I would love you to tackle the Gowrie conspiracy, another trial corpse, by the way. Would you like to do it? Also includes James VI and the second.
Do you know, I would love to, but what I find really interesting about that is it happened over such a short time frame. So there would have to be some event that you could focus on, because I think that does give it an immediacy. It feels like it's happening in real time. So when you have to, for context, there's so much context to add in there, it's quite difficult to make it an immediate story. And I love research. So I'm scared of going near stories that have too much research in them because I know that I'll love it and it'll all end up getting cut. So so I have to be very careful what stories I hove near to. But if you do find something like, if I find a story like that that's too chewy, what I do is I take the elements of it. So if I've come across a story that I find really interesting, I think about the elements of it and peel them away and work out what's compelling about them. So conceivably, I wouldn't necessarily write it, but I would steal things from it.
Any other questions from our audience here? Anybody want to ask anything? Raise your hand if you do, but in the meantime, DR asks, how do you build your characters? Did you refer to any primary sources in trying to build a picture of who Rizzio was?
So, well, I had those two statements about what actually happened on the night. And apart from that, because he was a servant, he's very much an absence in the story. He's an absolutely fascinating character. Very often people will tell the story, like Mary Queen of Scots or Rizzio or Lord Ruthven will tell the story about what happened, and they'll say there was no one in the room but us, and then you realise, no, well, there must have been like 10 servants in the room, but those people didn't register. So Rizzio he walked from Savoy to Edinburgh. When Mary Queen of Scots became monarch, everyone all over Europe came to Edinburgh. Edinburgh was like Berlin in the early 90s. It was where it was happening. New things were afoot. You know, religious toleration was talked about, actually, which was like a really radical, kind of crazy idea. It was like marrying your dog. I mean, it was just like, what? And so lots of delegations came here, and then they saw the weather, and I think they all turned around and went back after a couple of months. But it was felt that Edinburgh was a really radical place, and anything was possible. So, but David Rizzio really liked it, and he decided to stay. So he paid his way into the choir, which was something he did. He had a lovely singing voice. And even the other choir members called him David the Singer, because he had such a beautiful voice. So he would sing in church, and he was Catholic, obviously, and the Queen saw him singing, and she started talking to him. And I think she realised they were from the same sort of peripatetic background. And she realised that he spoke a lot of languages, and she spoke a lot of languages. I mean, I think one of the big misconceptions about her is that she only spoke French. She actually spoke beautiful Scots with a really good accent. Anyway, so they became friends, and then she started delegating translations of documents to him and things like that. And he rose up through the ranks really quickly. But people resented him because he suddenly had a lot of power. And because he was foreign, and because he was a man who was friends with the Queen, and he had strange habits. So one of the big things that he did wrong, Ruthven walks in and basically said, "You're wearing a hat in the presence of the Queen," which, you know, in the Duchy of Savoy was not an unusual practice, and he was wearing a boss outfit, by the way. He was a really snappy dresser, which was a crime then, apparently. And so he was a really, really interesting character, and self-educated. I mean, his father wasn't moneyed. He spent all his money on training 3 of his sons, basically, to be civil servants. And so he was a really interesting, but there are a lot of absences in the things that we know about him. And he, but she really loved him. And he worked for Darnley before he worked for her. And I think they might have been lovers, actually. He slept in his bed, but that was a form of intimacy then, because the bed was not a private space then. The servants would sleep around the bed, and you would sleep in the bed. But David Rizzio slept in his bed with him. So that was very intimate, you know. And Darnley did have male and female lovers. So, you know, I suspect that Rizzio was a bit in love with him. From the way he reacts and things that he's reported to have said in the middle of the attack, and so that brings a whole other dynamic. But there are a lot of absences in what's said about him.
We've just got a few moments left. Tell us, that bloodstain in Holyrood Palace, is it Rizzio's blood?
No. So the curator who I was with, she's brilliant. She's so pragmatic, you know, and she was sort of saying, you know, the floor used to be 6 inches lower. So it's not. But what's really interesting, I mean, the whole story, Mary Queen of Scots never went back to Holyrood Palace because it was so disturbing. It was such a disturbing incident. Those apartments were completely forgotten. They were shut down. They used it as a junk room. And then Walter Scott wrote about this period, and he wrote about Mary Queen of Scots. And so it became a big, I mean, it would be like people looking for a Harry Potter land in Scotland or going on the train, right? So tourists from England fell in love with Mary Queen of Scots. And there's a brilliant bit in Johnson and Boswell's Tour of the Hebrides where Boswell says, you know, Scotland should be independent, and Dr. Johnson says, you know, you were independent and you had a beautiful queen and look what you did to her, and she was in prison for 20 years and none of you ever came for her. So the English appreciated her long before, so they started coming up and getting private tours of the rooms and taking junk away, because it was a junk room, and then they would say, this wardrobe belonged to Mary Queen of Scots. And all these things were made 100 years too late. But so that's part of that whole kind of fantasy, romantic re-remembering of Mary Queen of Scots. But for 150 years, nobody wanted to remember any of it. So, like many things, it's a police reconstruction.
Denise, we've got to leave it there. It's been an absolutely fascinating hour. Thank you so much. Thank you to all for being our live audience. Thank you for watching online and on the big screen outside. Please, let's just thank Denise Mina.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thanks very much.